Hey, what's up? Nathan here from PH Studios. Welcome back to another After Effects tutorial. And in this tutorial, I'm going to talk about the Hyperspace Effect that you've seen in the past videos. So I created two effects of this in the past. One of them was a basic effect that I created about 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now. And I uploaded that around March 2009. I was working on it since about August 2009, or August 2008, and I uploaded it in March 2009 on YouTube, I believe. Lots of people wanted the tutorials and the project file for it, so I finally decided to do a tutorial on that. After the Space Shooter series was done and I had to get the Tower Defense series started, then I was able to focus on this and get this going. So that was the very first one I created. I created another one just so I could change things up a bit and introduce the After Effects series by showing you a cool effect that I created. So let me walk you through the two different versions. This is the original version. And this is the new version. Now, I like the look of the original version, some of it, the look on the original version, a little bit better than the new version. But I like the camera shake that I did on this new version, and we'll get to that in a later tutorial when I talk about cameras. I like the wave effect of the old one better than the new one. The new one is sort of like lightning. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into After Effects and let's get started. Let's create a new project. And let's create a new composition. It's going to be 10 seconds long. And it's going to be 29.97 frames per second. With HD resolution 720, so it's 1280 by 720, and background is black is okay, and let's click OK. Alright, so this effect here, I'm going to pause it here. Let's go from the background up. So the very background is going to be this effect you see here. And I call this a wave effect. As you can see behind the particles, behind these particles here, you will see it kind of wave. It'll look like a wave going out. It kind of looks like a wave. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about that layer now. So let's go to Layer, New, Solid. Let's make it a white color. Make sure that the comp size is clicked. And let's call it Wave Layer. And click OK. Okay, so what this effect does is it's just lots of particle systems combined with lots and lots of effects. And this really has a disadvantage, which I'll talk about later on. But for now, let's go ahead and build that wave effect. Alright, so let's go ahead and do Effect, Simulation, CC Particle World. Let's turn off all the grids. Let's change the particle type to Lens Convex. And we can scrub through the timeline. And you can see it work here. Alright, so let's scrub through and stop at a certain point in time. And let's go ahead and change the physics. Let's change gravity to 0. Alright, so now it's just flying out pretty fast. So let's change the velocity to about 0.5. Alright, that's a little bit slower. And let's change the longevity. Let's decrease that and decrease the birth rate too. Okay. So now, producer. Let's leave the positions at 0, 0, 0. Let's increase the radius X. To about there. We basically want it to be at the edges of the composition plus a little bit further. So around 0.5, 0.475, that's okay. Now we want the radius Y to be a little bit below that. Just a little bit. Alright, we want the radius Z to be above that. Okay, so now we have a decent particle system. But what we really want is that wave effect that you saw. So that is a combination of several blurs. And let's go ahead and add those now. The first one is radial blur. So let's go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and CC Radial Blur. And we change the type to Centered Zoom. And let's set it by a certain amount. 37 is okay. And quality doesn't really matter. So let's set the quality at 50. Quality doesn't really matter in this case. We're not that concerned about it. As long as it's not 0 or 10. So let's set it at 50. Okay, next up is Effect. And you've seen this before if you used After Effects. Basically, it picks this center point here, and it can change the center point to which it'll blur. And it will blur everything by that amount. And it will blur coming from that point, fading out. So think of a TV show when they're entering faster than light or hyperspace and all the stars fly past them. That's basically what this blur is doing. Okay. So next up is vector blur. And this one's a little bit hard to describe. If you have a very low amount, it'll look kind of like lightning. And if you increase the amount, it'll look like each particle has its own effect. And that effect looks like a gradient. And it randomly goes from dark to light to dark, back to light, and all that stuff. So if we select a specific middle point, it'll look kind of interesting. And if we increase this by a certain amount, and then let's also increase the angle offset, you'll see what happens here. So let's increase the angle offset to about here. Ridge smoothness. As you can see, if we increase this, the effect goes away. So let's set this by a small amount. How about right there? And let's leave the map softness at 15. Okay. So at this point here, we do not get that wave effect. It's because all these particles are flying by pretty fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease the velocity. I want to keep it above 0 because I want it to fly out. And let's go ahead and go back to the producer and decrease the radius Z. Just by a small amount. And let's leave it like that. Okay. So now let's increase the birth rate and longevity. And let's do a quick RAM preview to see what this looks like. It looks like a little bit too much, so let's go back. And this is what usually happens when you create an effect. Just kind of guess and check. Let's have it a little bit faster. And let's make sure that the size of the particle decreases as it dies. So as long as it's below 0.25, that's okay. Alright. Now let's look at the radial blur. Go ahead and decrease that amount just a little bit. And let's decrease the velocity just a little bit more. And now let's see what that looks like. Alright, now it looks like things change a little bit too quick, so if I increase the longevity, I want to decrease the birth rate. Because particles last longer, I do not want more born. I just want to increase the longevity and decrease the birth rate, because I want this effect to be longer. Okay, and if you really want that effect that I had at the very beginning, you want to change the producer, because everything looks fine. And if we change the producer's settings here and here, and decrease Z as well, it's a lot smaller, which means it'll stay in the frame and it'll look more like a wave. Because otherwise it just looks like particles flying past the camera and we just added effects to them. Now Y might be a little bit too much, or too little, is what I meant to say. So let's increase the Y a little bit. Let's try to match that one. Okay, and let's decrease this one a little bit more, decrease this one. Okay, like I said, you get into a After Effects mode and it's pretty much a guess and check. Even though I wrote some of it down, some settings interfere with other settings that I might have changed up here, and you really can't duplicate it exactly. Okay, so what I just did here is I selected the bottom layer, the only layer you have, and I went to Edit and Duplicate. Or you can just do the keyboard shortcut there. And we want an exact duplicate, which means we do not want to modify any of the effects here. We just want to lower the opacity by selecting the layer and pressing T. Then I'll bring the opacity here, and let's lower it down to 50%. And I spent a lot of time adjusting that layer, so I'm going to go ahead and speed things up a little bit. Alright, so now that we have a 50% opacity, we select that same layer and press the W key. This will allow us to rotate this layer, and let's go ahead and rotate it. This will give us that circular feel, and that's when the wave really comes out. As you can see, it looks kind of like a wave now. Like I said, if you're looking at this layer, it does not look like anything like the end result. It just looks like particles with effects thrown in them. However, we just added a second layer and we offset the rotation by a certain amount, and now it looks more and more like a wave effect. You can even bring that further by duplicating it again and rotate it by a different amount, and it'll increase that circular wave feel. So as you can see, I rotated it by 15 degrees, so if I duplicate it again, I press the button R on the keyboard, and I can change this to about 30. And it's rotated about the same amount. Now it's starting to look circular, and we can duplicate this by a different effect, but I only wanted 2. But you can see where this is going. Okay, enough of that. Let's go ahead and let's get started. It's about 16 minutes into the tutorial, and we only did 2 layers, so I'm going to speed things up. 2 layers, one rotated by one offset of the rotation by a certain amount, and it gives it more of a wave look. So that's what we want. So now we want to create the actual particles, and we do that by 3 different particles. So let's go ahead and create a new layer, a new solid layer. Make sure it's the same color. Make comp size is clicked, and let's call it main particles. Same thing as before. Let's go to Effect, Simulation, CC Particle World. And I have my notes here. Let's uncheck everything in the grid and guide section. Okay, so let's change the particle to lens convex, just like before. And let's change the physics to the gravity to 0. Okay, so now what we want here is we want particles to be really fast but have very high resistance. What that means is that they will fly out extremely fast, but they will slowly slow down. So I want to increase the velocity, but I also want to increase the resistance. And as you can see, if I have a high resistance at 5.6, let's really match up the velocity. And let's increase the resistance again. I'm going to solo this layer and let's demonstrate what happens. So as you can see, they fly out, then they stop. And that's kind of what we want. But we do not want it by that large scale. So let's decrease the velocity. And let's decrease the resistance. We want it about right here. So let's see how that looks. Alright, let's decrease the velocity again. I do not want it to fly out that fast. And let's decrease the resistance. So I want it to fly up fairly slow and then stop. So that looks okay. So that's fast, but that's not due to the velocity. That's due to the particles' birth rate. So let's decrease the birth rate. Alright, so let's unsolo this layer. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to do a effect and blur, CC radial blur, just like last time. And let's blur it by the same amount. Oh, I'm on scratch. And that's the other way that I'd mentioned that you can do a circular effect, which is the scratch of the CC radial blur. That'll make a circular effect, but I want it to do a centered zoom. So let's have it by a certain amount. How about here? Okay. Now let's actually increase the longevity. There we go. That looks good. Now they're flying out way too far. So what I need to do is I need to go into the CC particle world and producer. So I want to change the radius X, Y, and Z to be 0. Okay. And also, if I do that and then decrease the velocity and then the resistance, I'll leave about right here. This is the kind of the effect that we're looking for. Alright. So, that's it for this one. We might do a little bit more adjustments, but let's go ahead and duplicate this layer. So let's select the main particles layer. Let's go to Edit and Duplicate. And let's increase the birth rate. And let's increase the velocity just a little bit. Okay. So now, what this is going to do is we want this to go inside the center point, not outside like it currently is. And a cool technique here that I thought was pretty cool to do, it's very simple. Instead of flying out, we want it to fly in. Now, to achieve this in a very simple way, we right-click the layer, and we go to Time and Time Reverse Layer. And as you can see, it has a red line underneath it. That means that it's time reversed, and now it's going inside the center point instead of outside. So that's what we want. If we unsolo this, let's lower the opacity to about there. And let's go ahead and offset it. Just move it around the timeline. And at this point here, we want to match as close as possible to the maximum point that this layer achieves. So about right here. So about 2 seconds in, we want it to start. And we want it to start by slowly fading in. And what's the best way to do that? The best way to do that is to manipulate the opacity over time. So if we select this layer and press T, we get the opacity. And at the very beginning, let's enable this keyframe, set it to 0. And let's scrub through a little bit, and let's set it to 51, to what it was originally set. And it will slowly fade in. We can even increase this amount, and we can select this keyframe, go to Keyframe Assistant and Easy Ease, and let's see what this looks like. Actually bring it in around here, and then we can fade it in even further. We want it fully on by that point. Now let's do easy ease on the first keyframe as well. Okay, and for this one, if you want to, again, for the sake of the tutorial, I'm trying to speed things up, but if you want to, instead of having circles as the particles, you know, we can distort it, or we can do the vector blur again. Remember, it has that radial blur, so we can do a vector blur. And let's solo it just to see what that looks like. Very small amount, and let's see what that looks like. So this is what it looks like when it's on, and when it's off it looks like this. So just bringing down those the pure circle look. And the same thing with the main particle system if you want to. It's a little bit too much of a perfect circle, so we can distort it, or we can do that vector blur again by a small amount, and then we can unsolo that one, okay. Now if you think this one's a little bit too high on the opacity, just decrease this ending result, and just to make a subtle appearance that something's going into it as well. Okay, and there's not that many particles going out. So that'll be the third particle system. So I duplicate the original one, the main particles here. Edit, duplicate. And let's put that one above the one that's going into the center point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the radial blur. So let's solo this one. I'm going to increase the amount. Not that high, but to about 100. Okay. Let's unsolo that one. And let's adjust the particle system. We can offset it by like this. If we want to keep everything the same, just offset it, then increase it. And we can duplicate the main one again. Put that one below the very top one. And let's adjust the birth rate a little bit. And let's change the producer. Let's set it to radius, high radius. And let's see what that looks like. So again, just playing around with all the settings. It's pretty hard to duplicate things exactly, even though I wrote everything down. But it looks kind of cool on here. Now, if you want to change the color, you can do it several ways. You can create a layer above everything else, select the very top layer, go to New, Adjustment Layer, and let's go to Effect, Color Correction, and Hue and Saturation here. Let's colorize it. Let's decrease the lightness because it's pure white. Let's increase the saturation. And let's change the color to about here. And then let's decrease the saturation a little bit. Now that'll affect every layer below it. So if you want one layer to have green and the other layer to have blue, you're going to have to modify them differently. Okay, so now let's go to Effect, Color Correction, and Curves. And let's adjust this a little bit here. Let's brighten out, let's make it very bright. Okay, so now that that is done, now let's look at the very beginning of this video and the very end. We have the effect going from nothing to an explosion and then the fading out again. Now you can do this several ways. You can manipulate the size of each individual layer, or you can manipulate the birth rate of each individual layer, or the velocity of each individual layer, starting from 0 to a certain amount. Or you can create a new composition by dragging comp 1 to a new composition, which means you have a fully version of comp 1 complete, and then comp 2 has comp 1 inside it. And what we can do here is we can set the size scale. We can set it to a keyframe, and we set it to 0. We go in by a certain amount. Let's set it to 100. We go to the end. We set a point here, and we set it to 0. So there's lots of ways to get the scale effect. In the previous ones, I manipulated scales individually. So each particle layer, I had a different scale set. But in here, I just dragged comp 1 into a new composition. And now we have an effect here. So now if we increase the distance between these 2 points and these 2 points, it'll slow the effect down. And just like anything else, I like to do easy ease. Okay, so now let's have a look. Alright, looks kind of cool. Now we can manipulate the changes in here, and it will change in comp 2, because that's just referring to comp 1. So if we want to make some changes, we just make it in comp 1 here. And if we want to add an actual, let's look at the very first main particles, so layer 5. Let's duplicate that and move it below the second one. Alright, so let's offset this one again, and let's increase the amount of time. Let's remove the vector blur, so we have those dots again. And let's press W to rotate it, and let's rotate it by a certain amount. And let's set the producer, let's change these values a little bit. Not the XY, but the Z is what I'm worried about. Okay, let's see what that looks like. Now sometimes it will reach the edge of the screen, or edge of the composition. So if you want to fix that, just increase the, you have to click here back to the selection tool and increase the layer. So if we increase the layer, it will increase the particle system. So if we want to increase by a very large amount, we need to decrease the velocity. So there's all sorts of things that you can do to change it. I personally think this looks pretty cool. If you want to decrease the wave layer effect, just change the opacity, lower it by a certain amount to make it more subtle. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. It's been a busy weekend for me, so I'm a little bit tired and I have a stuffy nose, so hopefully it wasn't that bad of a tutorial. I will update the original, or upload the original product, which produces this result. And I'll upload the second project, which produces this result. And then I'll upload the tutorial project, which produces this result. So you can have a look and see what kind of things I did for each one of those. If you want to get those lines like I did before, you really need to ramp up the... You need to decrease the particle size and then really increase the zoom. So if you want to see what that looks like, just select this one here. And let's decrease the particle size. And it looks kind of like that. And let's really increase the, let's turn that off. Let's really increase the vector, or not vector, but radial blur. And that will produce those lines that you see in that video. And if we increase the birth rate just a little bit, and then the particle velocity, now let's have a look at that. Does that look familiar with those lines? So if we unsolo that, alright, so you have 3 different techniques to look at. I did a... the one I did originally had an interesting technique. And the one I did the second time, it did each layer individually. And I added a camera and a camera shake, so that was pretty interesting. And here you can see sort of a... cool effect type of thing here going on here. So there you go. That was a hyperspace effect. All 3 of those other effects will be uploaded in one single zip so you can look at them all. And I'll save that here. I have a hyperspace that will be in CS5. Hyperspace 2 will be in CS5. And hyperspace tutorial will be in CS5.5. You might be able to open it up in CS5. I haven't tried. So there you go. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope my nose is a lot better next weekend when I do the XNA tutorials. I will upload an XNA project that will deal with the camera, and I'll upload that to 4.0, XNA 4.0, and I'll just upload the project, and I'll do the video next weekend. So I hope to see you next time.